Yeah, sure. Well, last week we talked about the general issues and talked about some the demographics. Today we're going to start talking about each of the border states and to try to find what similarities there are, but it's mainly contrasts with each other. They're all they have unique experiences in the Civil War. In some ways, though, there are, some similarities. We want to talk about that. I want to touch on Missouri first. To me, that's a confounding, confusing state, and it makes Maryland look sane. You know, but I think the point is that this, as I think I alluded to the other day. Missouri there was a war going on in Missouri for a number of years prior to the firing on Fort Sumter, and they were at war not only with themselves. If you take a look at the map of Missouri, you'll see that it is the only state that is north of the 3630 line, but it's way north of the 3630 line. And so the point is that Missouri, which was a slave state, it bordered on Kansas, which came in 1861 as a free state. Iowa to its north, another free state. And it has, I don't know how many miles bordering Missouri on the other side of the Mississippi, Illinois, another free state. So it juts out geographically as a slave state within, with Union borders all over the place. So from a logistical standpoint, it made it very difficult, I think, for the Confederate side to supply Missouri. Missouri was just out there. It was surrounded fairly in some ways like Maryland. But there were slaves there. There were a lot of slaves. First, I was surprised that by 1860, Missouri, which was as far west as any state pretty much at that time, was already the 8th largest state in America. Population was 1.2 million people, the same as Kentucky, virtually, which had been a state from very early on. So Missouri was a state that was growing by leaps and bounds, and there were 115,000 slaves with that population. So it was not a high percentage of slaves in Missouri.
What were they growing like they wanted slaves?
Slaves, they were, some cotton. Well, remember,
I in north.
yeah, I mean, they were probably growing the same kind of crops that they were growing in the north. I mean, wheat, grain, those things. Now, interestingly, I found, I forgot what book it was, but Southerners, the planter class in the South, which grew mostly cotton and really maximized the use of their land to grow cotton, did not grow feed for the horses, feed for the animals, feed for the, grains for themselves. They imported that down the Mississippi River from northern states. So those were probably the kinds of things that they did in Missouri. But again, it had everything to do with slavery. One of the big reasons why it was growing so fast was because Southerners were trying to get in to ensure that it was a slave state, and they were bringing their slaves in with them. And Northerners from Ohio and Indiana and Pennsylvania were coming in to sort of protest that and take the land and make it a free state. So that was the beginning of the problem. And then as the debate over the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Remember, Missouri came in around, I think it was 1821, 1822. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was 1854. And so Kansas was coming in, and it did in 1861 as a free state. But the border wars between Kansas and Missouri had been going on. This was John Brown and Potawatomi, the sack of Lawrence, Kansas. This was a horrendous, bloody, horrendous war. And it was, they were arguing over the state constitution, whether it should or shouldn't have slavery. That was never really resolved. And so, but in the meantime, cities were growing. St. Louis had grown into one of the larger cities. I mean, it was the third largest city in the South behind, behind New Orleans, Baltimore, which was the largest. New Orleans was second. I think New Orleans and I should say St. Louis and Louisville were basically tied for third, close to each other. I'm not sure which was third, which was fourth. But St. Louis had grown to 190,000 residents. But what was really amazing about it was that only 40% of the white residents of Missouri were actually born there. Think about that. 60% of the people who lived in the state weren't born. They had moved over the last, since the last census, I suppose. And as a result, and here the amazing thing was that there in the city and county St. Louis, there were in 1860 90,000 German Americans. Now we talked about how the German Americans, moved out and found places to live in Cincinnati and places like that. I just found that out just the other day, and I was amazed by that. I do know this, that in Baltimore in 1861, there were 2 German language daily German newspapers. So German Americans, I don't know how many local German language newspapers there were in St. Louis in 1860, but there had to be at least one. That was a pretty astounding thing to think that many people of one ethnicity could have gone that far west in this country by that period of time. And of course, we know that generally speaking, there must have been some exceptions, but German Americans, as with many other immigrants, were anti-slavery. They were not slavery. There's a famous German-based town in Texas, New Braunfels, Texas, and there was a horrendous massacre of those people by Confederates because they were being conscripted to join the Confederate Army, and they refused to do that. They tried to leave Texas south to get to Mexico, and they were caught. And I forgot the number that were killed. It was a massacre, and so they were as an ethnic group, they were pretty determined not to participate in the promotion and development of slavery or serve in the Confederate service. Yes.
I have a request. One, talk a little bit louder.
Okay.
She said the sound's coming in and out. Can you repeat their questions apparently?
Oh, okay.
They couldn't hear one of the questions.
Okay.
Tried to tilt this a little bit.
Okay. I think I went. What was the question?
I asked what were they growing?
The question was what was being grown by the slave owners in the South that required slavery. And I can't say that I know for sure. We pretty have to presume that there was not cotton, but there might have been some tobacco. That's a good question. I have a sense though that they were growing grain, feed grain for animals and for supplying points south in the Confederate in the southern states, the cotton growers who did not grow food crops. Okay. All right. So St. Louis is a phenomenon as far as I'm concerned, much like Baltimore. It was a large city. It was a river city. They had everything to do with shipping all the grain and supplies, from out to the down the Mississippi, all the way down from the Minnesota, from Minneapolis, where the Mississippi starts, and I think that they had. Interestingly, prior to the war, General Lee, Robert E. Lee, was assigned to Mississippi and did great work in protecting the docks and the harbor in St. Louis from the tides, from the storms, from the surges of the Mississippi River. And one of the friends that he had in the Army who became very close with him was Montgomery Meigs, who became the Quartermaster General of the Union Army. And Meigs had a great relationship with Lee prior to the war, but came to really despise him during and after the war. It was over the murder of Meigs' son, who was also in the Army, and who was murdered by the Confederate partisan Rangers in Virginia. And that's what it was. Montgomery Meigs, who then, as Quartermaster General, took over Lee's property in Arlington and made it a Arlington National Cemetery. Just for the record. But the point is that they were together in St. Louis, and they did the Army Corps of Engineers which was strictly the Army at the time, did a lot of great work, and they made the port work despite the currents and the top whatever water factors hurt that city. So it was able to grow. It was able to prosper, and for whatever reason, and it became the gateway for further migration west, and served that for decades after the war. So Missouri is a unique place. The Jefferson of Columbia was the capital. If you know the Columbia is pretty much in the middle of the state. But I was interested to see that in the state there were there were 115,000 slaves in the state, and whereas in Baltimore there were half and half practically, free blacks and slaves. In Missouri, there were only 100. In St. Louis, while there were 4,346 slaves, there were only 109 free blacks listed in the census of 1860. So it was like Kentucky, where there were just only 1%, a very small percentage of free blacks. If you were an African American in St. Louis, you were very likely a slave, and worked in the docks and or in homes or wherever. But it was not a high percentage of slaves. There were 3,500 free blacks statewide out of 115,000, so that's a pretty small number. And when you start to think about it, 115,000 slaves statewide in a very large state like that is very different than the comparison with Maryland, where there were 170,000 African Americans living in Maryland, much smaller state. So they were many more closely packed groups of blacks. Now, half of them were technically free, but they weren't really free. They were just not slaves, but they were still under the thumb socially, and legally. And so in a large state like Missouri, 115,000 people spread out over a large state like that isn't all that overwhelming. And it doesn't strike the kind of fear that it did, for example, in the Deep South, where you had many 50-50, black and white. And so the fear factor wasn't quite the same. The motivations were pretty strong, however, with the slaveholders. They fought, they literally, they came to settle Missouri into it, and they were there and they were ready to fight. The border ruffians, you might have heard that expression. They were a tough set. They were not like the old-time planters of Virginia and South Carolina. They were younger and aggressive, and they didn't apparently hesitate very much to get into, use their weapons to get their way and to get their laws that promoted slavery and protected slavery. So along comes 1861, and Governor Claiborne Jackson was duly elected. He was a hardcore secessionist. The legislature in Missouri was, as most other legislatures were in slave states were, predominantly planter class people, and decided that they wanted to do everything they could to join the Confederacy. But the St. Louis people and other areas of the state protested that, and so they tried to talk it out. Governor Jackson and leading voices, Franz Siegel and Carl Schurz, were the political leaders of the German American community in St. Louis. And they tried to talk it out with respect to coming up with some sort of compromise. Well, that really didn't work. And there was an arsenal in St. Louis. And the pro-secessionist forces created a camp right near, just outside of St. Louis. I'm not sure if it was west or south, but they created this camp, and Colonel Nathaniel Lyon was in charge of the Union Army, and he was responsible for the arsenal, for protecting the arsenal. Well, what he did was he moved a substantial number of the newer weapons across the river. Once he realized that there was going to be a direct threat to the arsenal, he moved many of the weapons across the river to the Illinois side to protect them. And then what they did was they attacked, and using a lot of the German soldiers who joined the Union side, as Unionists, went ahead and attacked the camp. The Confederate camp, captured a lot of them, and then brought them into St. Louis as prisoners, and there was rioting in St. Louis. But the point was that it drove any organized Confederate troops away from St. Louis. And basically, as troops were able to reinforce from other states, St. Louis area, and protect it, it became stronger and less and safer from Confederate occupation or taking over. So that the St. Louis as a city, as an infrastructure with manufacturing and shipping, et cetera, was never really an asset to the Confederacy. So it would have been the third largest city in the Confederacy. It quickly became a non-factor. The other problem was that, like Maryland, early in the war, the Confederate side was not organized enough to support the secessionists in Missouri. So they were basically pushed to the southern part of the state in numbers. southern and western portion of the state, and that was their stronghold. And essentially, what they largely were able to do during the war was to do raids and just attack. It was sort of just basically a larger scale continuation of what was going on in Missouri prior to the war, just bigger numbers. And there was no charade anymore. It was troops. Now, on the other side of the coin, the Union side was able to reinforce and had the manpower. They quickly developed the river fleets to use the rivers as the avenues of supply, as they did throughout the southern states. And that was one of the crucial aspects of the border South to the Union cause. It gave access to the Deep South via the rivers. The only thing they didn't have in 1860, 61 were the river boats to use as vehicles to get it down the river. However, in St. Louis, one of the large businesses, one of the large opportunities was headed by a man named James Eads, E-A-D-S, and he built river gunboats. And the biggest factory was in St. Louis. He had other factories built other parts for the boats elsewhere. But for the most part, St. Louis became the capital of the Union production of river gunboats. So the gunboats and the troop boats. And so eventually they're the boats that led, to the capture of Vicksburg, that ran the guns at Vicksburg in 1863 and opened the Mississippi up completely. But they were the boats that basically got out and attacked New Orleans in 1862 and took over the largest city in the Confederacy in 1862. So you can see that the size and the industry in St. Louis absolutely made it much easier for the North to do what it had to do to enter and control large sections of the South. So that is crucially important, and that's the role of the big of these states which failed to join the Confederacy. Now, there was, I think the Confederacy did recognize Missouri as a Confederate state. One of the stars on the Confederate flags, I think, is Missouri. On the other hand, it really wasn't much of a factor. And as the war went on, because of Missouri's geographic location, it became more and more isolated. And on the west side of the river, and as a result of that, like Arkansas had the same problem. Trans-Mississippi eventually became came largely under the control of Edmund Kirby Smith, General Kirby Smith, who, and not because they really wanted it that way, but because logistically, Jefferson Davis and the government in Richmond just couldn't do anything to supply them, or whatever little. I mean, they had a bad enough time just communicating together. And as a result, what's called the Trans-Mississippi, the other side, wasn't really, much of a factor in supporting the Confederate cause. And a big part of the reason why was because of the border state of Missouri, which, even though it had a presence in Richmond as a representative, wasn't really doing much of anything and wasn't providing, a whole lot of power for the Confederate cause. And as a result, there were 110,000 Missourians who fought for the Union and about 40,000 who fought for the Confederacy. But again, in a state that large, those 40,000 were fairly well spread out. But they did effectively serve as guerrilla forces and attacked where they could and did damage. And their war went on long after Appomattox, by the way. just as it had been going on, it stayed going on. And we know about Jesse James and, who was the other guy? Willie Bill Anderson. They were Confederates during the war, and they stayed Confederates after the war. And, as the legend goes. But they didn't impact the result of the war all that much because they were too few in number. But the crucial issue of Missouri was St. Louis. There were some battles fought there. I mentioned that Nathaniel Lyon, at the very beginning, organized an attack on those 900 secessionists, defeated them, captured them, tried to imprison some of them, but basically broke up secessionist Confederate activity. The threat to St. Louis was fairly well evaporated. But there were other battles, and the key thing in August of 1861, the first real battle, first large battle west of the Mississippi was fought at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. Lyon was killed in August. No major advance. 17,000 men was still a good sized battle at the time. Until, I think it was a month later, on the other side of the Mississippi, a little bit further south, the Battle of Shiloh occurred. That's why you don't hear too much about Wilson's Creek, because Shiloh was a much larger battle, and it had far more significance because it drove a large, that basically the Western Confederate Army, it drove them off of the Mississippi down into into the state of Mississippi and out of Tennessee. Shiloh is in part near the southwestern corner of the state of Tennessee. And Grant and Sherman had used the river to get down in that area, and essentially they drove the Confederates out, and then eventually they captured Memphis, which was another large southern city, and Memphis became useless to the Confederate cause. But Wilson's Creek was, the battle was fought, and it was a stalemate. Lyon was killed, but when Lyon was killed, that was sort of like the equivalent of when Joe Johnson was wounded before Richmond and Lee took over. Johnson acknowledged after the war that was the best bullet that ever happened, that was ever shot, because it put Lee in charge on the Confederate side. Lyon was okay, I suppose, but after he left, it put Fremont in charge of the Union forces, and his superior was Henry Halleck, Old Brains Halleck, who Lincoln eventually put in charge as the general-in-chief of strategy and everything in Washington until Grant took over in 1864. But between Halleck and Fremont, they were pretty solid in terms of Union leadership of the military theater in St. Louis and that area. So it kind of was a strong group. They had the men, they had the machinery, they were making more. Again, early in the war, the Union was not prepared for a war like this. They had to build, but they had the cities to do it. And they took advantage of that. And so soldiers like Grant understood that they could now use the waterways and use these ships to start making incursions into the South. And they did. Grant took Fort Donelson and Fort Henry and in Tennessee, and he used that, and they kept moving, and they wound up with Shiloh. They won at Shiloh, and they kept moving south. And so the point would be that things started coming together because the states like Kentucky and Missouri became staging areas for the Union side and not under the control of the Confederate side. It's that simple. But it's sort of like, you don't really hear too much about that, but that's what was going on, especially early in the war, to have all those industrial places where there were thousands of people lived, it was a quiet godsend for the Union side, because any war you have to have people, but you have to have the material. Remember, I mentioned that early in the war, Jefferson Davis and the Confederate government had to send thousands, 100,000, 150,000 volunteers back home because they couldn't equip them. They couldn't give them uniforms, they couldn't arm them because they didn't have the weapons. To have that many people volunteer at any point would have been strategically overpowering. But they couldn't do it because they weren't ready. And at one point or other, they never did get ready. And they never did accomplish what the Union accomplished because of the lack of industrialization in the South. They had to start importing rifles from England, and to one extent they were Enfields, I guess. They were good weapons, but they had to get them. They had to get their boats across to pick them up and get them back and go through the Bahamas. That was tenuous. They couldn't do it as fast, and they couldn't do it as well. The Confederacy early in the war was very successful on the field, and the way that they really did largely equip themselves was from Union weapons that were left on the field. They won a lot of battle, or the Bull Run thing, Second Bull Run, Second Manassas, Chancellorsville. Those were all largely technically Confederate victories, and they captured thousands of arms and ammunition, cannon, and so that's largely how they supplied themselves, despite not having much in the way of arms factories in the South. So what we're looking at is fights going on. The Confederate general was Sterling Price. He had control of the Confederate troops that were basically centered in large bodies of Confederate troops, however large, 40,000 men. And that's in total. That was not necessarily 40,000 men at any one given time. That was over the course of 4 years. But he was judged not to be a terribly effective guy, and he was never a large threat. The Confederates that were in the southern part of the state were never truly a large threat to St. Louis or the Union armies. And one of the things was they couldn't really be reinforced. It was sort of like the Western Front. They had Arkansas and Texas on the far side of the river. But those Arkansans, there were Arkansans in Lee's Army of Northern Virginia and Texans in Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. But somehow they never made it to Missouri. The government got them west early in the war. But they weren't able to resupply or reinforce the Missouri theater. So that became a backwater from the Confederate standpoint. It wasn't all that strategically important other than St. Louis, which they couldn't get to anyway. So they had to, just continue to do their guerrilla raids, which they did fairly effectively, and to whatever extent that it kept the war going there, they did it. So then there was, in talking about St. Louis, that Franz Sigel and Carl Schurz were big supporters of Lincoln in the 1860 election. And interestingly, in New York, in Manhattan, at the West Side Park, I just ran across this when I was visiting with some friends who lived on the Upper West Side of New York at about 120th Street, and I went over to the West Side Drive, and there was a statue And it looked like a Civil War statue, so I walked over to it, took a look, and I was Franz Siegel on a horse. What would be going on here? Well, Franz Siegel was a great recruiter. Lincoln put him, he knew that Franz Siegel had great influence with German Americans nationwide. And so he used him, and he made him Siegel. Yeah, he was the general. He was in the 11th Corps as a general under Oliver O. Howard. But the point is that he recruited German Americans everywhere. And apparently in New York, I'm not sure exactly how that statue or why it was there, but it was a statue of Franz Siegel because I think Lincoln, appreciated him and really used him. And that helped Lincoln recruit more and more of the immigrant types who were still coming to the United States. So I thought I was amazed to see that. I have to acknowledge that. I never forgot it. Okay. So essentially the rebel cause was frustrated. And the fighting was confined. There was one battle where the Confederates did move fairly well north. And that might have been Westport. Yes, Battle of Westport. That's about as far as any major incursion occurred. It was Westport. Battle of Westport was fought in 1864. It was like a last gasp. And it was not far from Kansas City. It was like halfway between Kansas City and Columbia, capital of the state, which is fairly well the middle of the state. So that they left that southern area. They were defeated and removed themselves. They escaped. They weren't all captured, but after that, it was a hopeless situation for the Confederate side of the state of Missouri. They never really were a major threat during the war to take over the state. And whereas the state constitution was argued over and then fought over early on, as time went on, the Union side controlled that state, and there were two state governments. The Confederate side still maintained a government that they felt like they were being represented in Richmond, and the Union side had its own state legislature and state government, and they were represented in Washington. Yes.
I'm curious, how developed were the railroads in Missouri?
Okay. The question was how developed were the railroads in Missouri? Not very, but I think that there were connections there weren't bridges yet over the Mississippi, but there were ferries. There were plenty of ferries. That's how the Confederates early in the war, in protected areas, they could move troops freely across the Mississippi to railheads on the Mississippi side. That's where Vicksburg, I think, was a crucial point. That was the main value of Vicksburg, because it was a railhead right on the Mississippi. Memphis was a railhead. Cairo, Illinois, in the southern part, the southernmost point of Illinois, that was a railhead. But it was a struggle. Mississippi was still the father of waters at the time, and it was a big obstacle for railroading. But the fact eventually they did that, but that's how they negotiated it. The Susquehanna was very much the same up here, because there was no bridge. They had the ferry that took trains from Port Perryville, the lower, on the northern side of the Susquehanna, D-train, moved the people, transported the people across on ferries, and then they had half to grace. They got on the train on the south side. That's how they did it back in those days. But the point is that the train system in out there was still pretty primitive. There are very few lines. Okay. So the northern side called the state convention strongly, and they had physical control over most of the state, so they could call a convention, and they did. And they rejected secession, they rejected slavery, and they declared themselves the state government for the duration of the war. So the war was out. The war itself was anticlimactic, but the prelude and the logistics and the way it started, the early part of the first 6 months, were telling, because the Union side basically had a lot of power, and it was centered in St. Louis. Interestingly, I found that the second and third largest cities were Kansas City and St. Joseph, Missouri, in 1860. But they only had 22 and 23,000 residents, respectively. St. Louis again had 190,000. So it was the big, the 500-pound gorilla in the state of Missouri on the Mississippi, strategic place, and they were the powerhouse. Whoever controlled St. Louis, even though it was on the very side, on the border, largely controlled the state. And I think that was pretty much the story of the Civil War in Missouri. And fortunately for the Union side, they were St. Louis was a free soil type of dominated population, and basically they just asserted themselves. And with leaders like Siegel and Schurz and Fremont and Halleck, they had the strong enough leadership to accomplish that right from the outset. As time went on, they just got stronger. And at no point did the Confederate side really threaten to take over the state and make it a strong Confederate stronghold. Questions? Yes.
Well, the Southern, you said there was like a group that was from politicians that were Northern, government, and then where was the Southern, where were they based?
In the southwestern part of the
Like
state.
Springfield?
Yeah. Exactly. Very good. Thank you. You're Missouri. And yes, that's where they were. And that's where the slaves tended to be. Slaves were spread out, I'm sure, all over the state. I'm not sure how much more intensely the slaves were located prior to the war in the state of Missouri. But as it happened, there was far more dedication to the Confederate cause in the southern part of the state because it bordered Arkansas. And just as I mentioned last week that in Kentucky, for example, and in Maryland, the northern part of the state did a lot of business north. The northern part of Missouri was all bordered by Union states. That they were not anxious to do much with the South. Their economies were probably very much like those bordering states, Iowa, Kansas, Illinois. They were largely farming states, and as a result, they collaborated probably prior to the war. They grew the same kinds of things. They had a lot of the same type of interests. There were no big cities in the northern part of Missouri. Nothing large, nothing big. There was just 22,000 people in Kansas City at the time. It was still pretty small, and as a result, there was no power, no economic power, and certainly no strong population to move in the direction of secession or pro-slavery. And so, but that was the Achilles heel in a lot of ways of the whole Confederate movement. Slavery, especially plantation slavery, fairly well eliminated industry. And as a result, everything was spread out. There were very little factory type of things. There were small cities throughout the South. I think Richmond, in 1860, Richmond was less than 40,000 people. Became the capital of the Confederacy. Montgomery, Alabama, the first capital of the South, was another really small city. It's probably smaller, not much bigger than Kansas City and St. Joseph, Missouri. And so that was the Achilles heel that hurt the South, because again, they couldn't transport troops very effectively. They couldn't. There were the exception, as I mentioned, was Josiah Gorgas, the quartermaster general of the Confederacy, who worked miracles to make sure that the armies in the field were equipped and had strong arms and plenty of ammunition and artillery. Mainly because of the Treader Iron Works in Richmond, which manufactured a substantial portion of the Confederate artillery throughout the war, and they had good powder and ammunition factories in Augusta, Georgia, near Savannah, and in Columbus, Georgia, where Fort Benning is. And so that kept them in the war, but they weren't really strong, and they were never able, for example, to create a river navy the way the North did. What they did with Eads and Poop, they were the two men who were the engineers and builders of the ironclad gunboats. That was Eads, and that was St. Louis. And Poop, I forgot his first name, but he engineered the creation of what were called Poop's turtles, which were river troop boats that were, fairly armed and protected the troops in the boat. But that's how they got up and down the rivers without too much destruction. And they were prepared. So they weren't there before the war, but as the war came about and the need became apparent, they were right there. They had the industrial facilities to do it. They started making them, and they made them in large numbers, and they did it very quickly to where there was never a shortage of river gunboats and river troop boats after the middle of 1862. So I think that's an integral part of how the North basically was able to occupy and then continually supply its troops over basically just under 500,000 square miles of southern territory over the course of, eventually of 4 years. But they started doing it effectively in 1862 with Grant and Sherman, and they kept getting better at it. And after, in 1863, with the Vicksburg event, prior to actually taking Vicksburg, that's when they first started using Confederate troops. What they did in Georgia was live off the land. They learned how to do that in Mississippi the year before. And that was a really crucial part of their strategy. Because not only did it help them, then the Confederate cause could use it. And it put more stress on the Confederate logistics. great stress on the Confederate logistics as time went on. So, okay. Questions on Missouri before I go on to Little Delaware? Yes.
This is a more general question from something you said. You said early in the war, the Confederates had more battlefield victories, right?
Yes.
Was that primarily due to leadership, due to the life the men led, maybe tougher fighters versus people in the North who might have been more, you know what I'm asking?
Yes.
What are your thoughts?
My thought is that the Confederates, had better leadership, but I think they also were fighting on their home ground. I think that in Virginia especially, they had that also, very important, they had a big advantage in cavalry because of Jeb Stuart. Jeb Stuart was a master cavalryman, and he knew Virginia. And not only Stuart, but his subordinates. They were fighting over land that they probably lived on or near. So they knew the back roads, they knew every place to go. And of course, that's where the Gettysburg, where they failed at Gettysburg, because they didn't know the terrain. And you could see right away that they got themselves into trouble. They were going in all the wrong directions. They had no idea where, the Second Confederate Corps was as it was moving north. The Second Corps under Ewell, prior to Gettysburg, got as far as the Susquehanna River at Riceville. They were there. They could have attacked Harrisburg had the Union not been on their tail and had he not had to call them back to quickly gather, because he realized that so many Union troops were so close to him. He didn't know, because Stuart wasn't informing him, because he was isolated. He isolated himself. But that's another course. I want to do that. I want to do a course, 3 days, Gettysburg, first day, second day, and third day. I think I'm really excited to do that. I think we'd have a good time with it. But as of now, they had that advantage early in the war, especially in Virginia. There was no such advantage out west, though. And one big thing that hurt them early on was the loss of Albert Sidney Johnston in 1862 at Shiloh. He was considered by Jefferson Davis as the #1 general military guy in the entire Confederacy. So, and Lee had a bumpy start in his leadership as well. That's why he wasn't in charge of the Army of Virginia until June 1862. Joe Johnston was. But that's another story from the top. Let's talk a little bit about another small slave state, Delaware. Delaware, next door to us in Maryland, much smaller. Delaware had 32nd of 33 states in terms of population. Small, still, the second smallest state even today, I think, to Rhode Island. 1,800 slaves, 20,000 free blacks. But they had no real border with the South. They were a border state, but they were only a border with Maryland. And there, if you go down the eastern shore, there's a very small part of Delaware that juts down fairly close to the Virginia border. But logistically speaking, it was no great. It was a great loss in one way, and it was a great important power for the Union in another way. And it wasn't the 13,000 Delawareans that fought in the Union Army. It was the DuPont factory, the gunpowder arms factory. They made gunpowder. They made, literally, I didn't realize this until I was preparing for this course last time at Washington College. They made about half the gunpowder for the whole Union Army. Well, that was pretty cool. Delaware did that, and that was an unfortunate turn, for the South. When Maryland did secede, Delaware couldn't secede, so they were not a factor. They were never really a factor. They weren't big, but that their place in the Union side made something of a difference, because not only did DuPont make all that gunpowder, the city of Wilmington and the fact it wasn't a huge city, but the point is that they had shipbuilders galore, and they were on the Delaware River, and they were a large industrial town, small city, but a large industrial town, and they did a lot of work with union contracts for ambulance carriages, rail car wheels, tents, knapsacks, shoes. They were a factor, a small factor, but they were there, and they were they were on that road, on that crucial rail line between New York, Boston, and points north, and Philadelphia, and Baltimore, and Washington. So they, if there had been a large underground movement in Delaware, to blow up bridges and do things like that, it could have caused the Union some real trouble, but it wasn't there, and there was nothing like that. Nothing like that occurred during the war. And so Delaware played its little role, provided a small number of troops, did its role, but it didn't. It was a border state. It was on the border, but it wasn't much of a factor, and the Confederates didn't work very hard to try to get it, and rightly so. So, questions on Delaware? Anybody from Delaware?
No.
Yes.
I never think of Delaware as a border state except the Eastern Shore. I mean, one of Tench Tillman's descendants was definitely Southern sympathizer.
I'm sorry?
One of Tench Tillman's descendants was a Southern sympathizer.
Oh,
Yeah, that's
General
Oh.
Tillman.
Tench Tillman. I mean, yes. I mean, he has his three sons were in the Confederate Army. One of his sons was killed I think it was in Mississippi in 1863. But he was our leading secessionist in Talbot County.
And I've read somewhere in the history of Oxford
Yes.
that log canoes were used to supply Virginia troops.
Right. Right.
They were doing
Anything they could use to supply. I mean, that was early in the war, before the Union Navy could really patrol it well. At one point, I think it was late 1862, there was a naval unit that was established in Dorchester County, Cambridge, to patrol the river and back. There was a lot of that went on at night, and so they did what they had to do, and but that was the secessionists in the state who were still very dedicated to getting the state out of the Union, regardless of the dangers that they could have caused if to the state overall, if this state had to be subdued to keep the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. We'll get to that next week when we talk about Maryland. But let's talk about Kentucky. How much time, Bert? 11 o'clock?
About a half an hour, yeah.
Good. Kentucky is almost the same population as Missouri. Big state geographically, substantial population of white people. Of the 1.2 million, 225,000 were slaves, which is 100,000 more than Missouri. And that was overall 20% of the population of the state. So Kentucky was more bought in. They were more reliant on slavery than certainly than Maryland, and certainly more than Missouri. Kentucky was a real slave state. It was a true slave state, and this has been for me personally. I can't figure out. I mean, I thought about it, and I write about it, but talk about it. But it's hard for me to believe that Kentucky stayed in the Union. To be honest, I have I had less of a hard time understanding why Maryland stayed in the Union. I see that. But Kentucky is pretty surprising. 1% of those 225,000 slaves were free. They were virtually, if you were black in Kentucky, you were a slave. You were not a free person. And considering, that there was the city of Louisville, that's, Louisville, I mean, there were, interestingly, in New Orleans, which was the biggest city in the South, there were probably 7,000 or 8,000 slaves free blacks in New Orleans who had working jobs on the docks, on the piers. And they could live, they were fairly, I'm sure, well controlled socially in living in a confined area, but they were not slaves. And because it was a port, a large port, they were able to live without being slaves, and work for themselves, not their masters. Not so much apparently in Louisville, and not so much in St. Louis either. So the point would be that that this was a state that was very big in tobacco, as it had been for years. They were slow to leave that, and they were showing no signs of moving away from slavery, like Maryland, because of the issues with the prices of tobacco on the market, on the open market. Kentucky stayed a hardcore slave state. The difference, though, is that the slavery and the slaves were largely in the southern and western portion of the state. When you think about Kentucky's geography, eastern Kentucky is hill country, just like East Tennessee and the Appalachian South. So that portion of Kentucky was largely like East Tennessee, lost largely to the Confederacy because it was mountainous. People could hide out. It was tough to get to them. There was a contiguous area of resistance to the Confederacy, that portion of Kentucky. So the slavery was largely limited to that bluegrass area of the southern and western part of the state. What was important and what turned out to be the most important, two things. Number one, politically. It was the state of Henry Clay, the Great Compromise, the man who came up with the Missouri Compromise, and that was their tradition. Kentuckians were always in the middle. They knew they were in the middle. It was not a matter of just doing it for the cause. They were realistic about things. And I think that the other point would be that too much of Kentucky's prosperity industrially in the northern part, that much of the northern border of Kentucky is the Ohio River. And the Ohio River borders on all these northern states, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and as a result of that, much of the northern part of Kentucky did business with the North. Their orientation was not towards slavery. They were trading food and crops They were industrial, it was industrial. And as a result, their direction was A, neutrality, but B, industry. And you couldn't stop the southern part of the state from having its interests in slavery. They had 225,000 slaves. That was a substantial number of slaves. But there were too many other interests. And those interests in the planter class, which dominated the Deep South and even the Middle South, like North Carolina, Arkansas, Tennessee, they didn't have the political pull of the legislature in Kentucky. Kentucky still had an awful lot of political power because of that whole northern swamp. Even though it was a slave state, the slaves didn't really reside there. And the people there didn't have that slavery orientation. Whites weren't afraid of abolition. Or they didn't want it, but they weren't living in fear of abolition, as they did in South Carolina, Mississippi, where half the people in the whole state were African Americans. And so between the tradition of Henry Clay and the presence at that time of Senator Crittenden. Crittenden was the U.S. Senator who led all of the compromise efforts in Washington in 1860 and 1861 to try to keep the Union going. He and our governor at the time, Hicks, Governor Hicks. They were on the same page. They wanted to create a middle confederacy between the North and the South to try to keep peace and to try to avoid becoming the battlefield, between North and South. They were very much aware of that, and some of their correspondence talks about it. They kind of couch it, in the peace terms, but they knew the score. They knew what would happen. Unfortunately for Virginia, they pushed themselves over the edge and they became largely the battlefield, and the state was pretty well physically damaged over the course of the war. So here's Kentucky, and what was going to happen? Uriah McGoffin was the governor, but he was more of a secessionist, but he knew he didn't have the power to push the legislature over the edge. So he worked with Senator Crittenden and decided on the theory of armed neutrality. They were going to do everything they could to stay neutral. They couldn't figure the idea of a central confederacy wasn't really practical. It just wasn't practical because armies were already on the borders, in early 1861. And so they did what they could to avoid becoming the battlefield of the war as long as they possibly could. And so they didn't raise armies. McGoffin refused Lincoln's request for their share of the 75,000 troops Lincoln called for after Fort Sumter. But they didn't really provide men for the Confederate side either, although there was no draft of Confederates, there was no call. They just volunteered. And I'm sure there were some who did volunteer, I suppose, but just determined to fight the other side. But it wasn't like called by the state. The state was trying to be neutral. That was it. I think it's fair to say that Kentucky felt a strong pull toward the Union, because of Clay and because of their voting history and their history in both houses of Congress. But they were going to try to be in the middle. The unions dominated the 1861 elections. They won 5 of the 6 congressional seats for Kentucky. The people voted willfully to remain in the Union. 5 of the 6 congressional districts. That said an entire mouthful for the sentiment, not only of the leadership, but of the voters of the state. Lincoln couldn't impact that vote like he could impact it later in 1861 and 1863 here in the state of Maryland. That was a vote of a true vote of Kentuckians. And that speaks a lot. A crucial mistake happened in September of 1861 when Bishop Leonidas Polk, who was also General Leonidas Polk in the Army of Tennessee, decided that he was going to cross over into Kentucky and protect that portion of Kentucky which had all those slaves and protect them from, the Union side. Well, that was a massive political error because Kentuckians, 5 of 6, 5/6 of whom were represented unionism, in Congress, took that as an invasion of the state, a Confederate invasion of the state, illegal. And, that created a harsh reaction to the extent that the Union side took advantage of that. Said, okay, and they cooperated with Governor Magoffin because they were being invaded, and Magoffin welcomed them in. And so they became the heroes. Yes.
We had a couple of, one, I love this comment because this is the person having trouble hearing.
Oh.
Everybody else says it's clear, but she says, aha, I think it's interference from all of the Confederate ghosts in this part of Virginia, surrounded by 4 Confederate or Civil War battlefields.
Thank you.
And that's Susie. And Chris asked, did Lincoln, a boyhood resident of Kentucky, frame the purpose of the war to preserve the Union in a large part to keep Kentucky in the Union?
Possibly. He had the sense. That's a good question.
It is.
I think possibly, but probably not. I don't think, he knew right from the outset that he needed Kentucky. He made a famous statement that I need Kentucky. That was because of the Ohio River and the transport on the Ohio River. Logistically, Lincoln had this sense, that this was going to be a not just a drop in the bucket kind of a war. I don't know. I can't really say. But I have a feeling that he understood that he needed the votes and the people and the hearts of the people. I think that he probably knew enough Kentucky. He had been out of Kentucky since childhood. His parents moved to Springfield, Illinois, when he was young, and that's where he grew up, so to speak. Educated himself, got his law degree, and practiced law on the circuit in Illinois. So he was a kid. So I'm not sure how much he
Illinois
knew.
was where his home.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how much he really knew about the internal side of things in Kentucky. But on the other hand, he probably knew enough about Kentucky to leave them alone because they wanted to be left alone. And, he knew that if enough Kentuckians voted for unionism, which they did, he wasn't nearly as worried about the state going on him. But the fact is that General Pope made it easy. And then McGoffin allowed grants to come in, and they started moving in, and they became the protectors of Kentucky. They didn't invade the state as an army would occupy. They became the protectors of the state, or perceived as such by most people, especially in the northern portion of the state, who were not going to so easily become part of the Confederacy. Those people understood in Maryland and in Virginia, they understood that, and I think we understood from his writings that Virginia and Maryland and Kentucky were being used by the Deep South. I think it's fair to say that. I think Davis was doing everything he could to avoid that perception. But I think those people knew why. Because what was happening was the first Confederate Army recruits, where were they going? They were going to Virginia to protect Virginia. They were going to northern Tennessee to oppose the Army, the Union forces that were largely, gathering up at Cairo, Illinois area, and in Kentucky, near the southern end of Kentucky, where the Ohio River meets the Mississippi. That was a huge strategic point. So that's what they were trying to do. And so it became very clear that all these armies coming north, let's on to Richmond, on to Washington, on to Washington. Well, that's what they were. They weren't just protecting their own home state. They were on to Washington. And it was very clear that that's what the objective of the Confederate Army was, just as it became the objective to move on to Richmond for the Union side. But for the people living in those states, they could see right away that they were going to be the battleground. Their homes, their communities, and I think enough Kentuckians and enough Marylanders and most Delawareans saw that. So the big deal was going to be in Virginia, because a lot of Virginians saw that too. But the Tidewater planters of Virginia said, "Bring it on. We're seceding." There was that strong an element in the state of Virginia. Why? Because Virginia didn't have a big city to protect. And they didn't have a big northern type city like Baltimore or St. Louis or Louisville to rally around and say, wait, this is a free city. We do business, much more business with the North than we do with the South, although we do a lot of business with the South too. And so Virginia succumbed eventually, and they became, along with Tennessee, I suppose, some of the worst battleground. I think Virginia was the worst, because eventually the Civil War came through Tennessee and passed it, and went down into Mississippi and Georgia. Somehow Alabama didn't get it all that badly. Georgia got it as bad as anybody, and North Carolina to some degree, but Arkansas got out of it. The eastern shore of Maryland wasn't touched at all, but other parts that became the battlefield suffered. The western portion of the state of Maryland suffered pretty badly during the war, as they were invaded for 3 years, 3 consecutive springs. They were invaded by the Confederates. And so, very early on in the war, Kentucky managed to evade the issue of secession, evade the issue of becoming a battlefield largely. There were several battles, a couple of battles before the Battle of Iuka, Mississippi. But be that as it may, I think that they they played it as well as anybody. And their ability to maintain their status in the Union was fairly significant. A large, not that many Kentuckians fought in the Civil War, although I have a number in here somewhere.
Your last
Very
bullet,
last sentence.
last bullet.
Okay. Not sure. But in any event, a far larger number of Kentuckians supported the Union than the Confederacy. Although Confederates did have their heroes, like John Hunt Morgan was the Confederate hero of that state. Yeah, this is a revised issue. 35,000. Yeah, Morgan was the head of the Second Confederate Cavalry. He did more cavalry forays, and he basically broke up the railroad with the He did, they did their damage. There were, the Union. We talked about, conquering territory and then supplying it. Well, in Kentucky, it was John Hunt Morgan. In Tennessee and Mississippi, it was Nathan Bedford Forrest. In Virginia, it was
I think the Gray Ghost, you're talking
the
about?
great, yeah. But it was my grandson's school was based.
Stewart?
No, it was on the tip of my tongue. He was a lawyer in Warrenton, Virginia.
Mosby.
Mosby, General John Mosby, John Singleton Mosby. But these guys terrorized the supply lines, and until those supply lines could be really secured, these Confederate cavalry raiders were really seriously dangerous to the Union side. And Hunt was maybe the most daring. Nobody could be more daring than Nathan Bedford Forrest, allegedly having 30 horses shot from under him during the course of the war, which is, think about that, how he could never be killed or captured without 30 horses shot. But we'll go along with it. In this case, though, John Hunt Morgan, he did a foray into Ohio. This was his most ambitious. So I got across the Ohio River, and when it moved into Ohio, but because of that, they saw it coming. The Union side saw it coming and trapped him and captured the Second Confederate Cavalry. And somehow Morgan was let go or escaped. I don't know what the story was, but it was such an embarrassment that he lost his whole cavalry unit, so that they never gave him any further. He was sort of like disgraced. So it's not disgraced, but sent off to smaller commands. But while he was running hot, he was a big name. He made a big name for himself in the Second Confederate Cavalry. But he kind of blew it by taking this meaningless adventure into Ohio. But
Comment. Maybe.
Yes.
Michael Davis says Mosby became a Union supporter after the war and served as a diplomat for the United States.
that is correct, and became very unpopular as a lawyer in Warrenton, Virginia, as a result of that. He did much of the same attitude that Longstreet had in New Orleans. New Orleans became Longstreet's home for after the war, and he was good friends. He was one of the. I'm not sure he was the best man, but he was in Grant's wedding party. He was very, very close with Grant at West Point, and they stayed very good friends. After the war, he he felt like the Southern interests would best be served within the Union, within the Republican Party. We could get more with honey than with vinegar. But that didn't work. And so he was terribly chastised and became the number one target of the lost cause mythology in Lexington, Virginia. Yes.
There's a fairly recent biography on Longstreet that has just come out in the last couple of years. I'm wondering if you've read that. Is that one of your 500 books?
Probably, because, I have to tell you, I invited, when I was the president of the Washington, D.C. Civil War Roundtable, I invited from Missouri, Southwest Missouri State, University, the author of the book on Longstreet called Lee's Tarnished Lieutenant. And I can't think of his name now. But I invited him, and I met him, and I had lunch with him. We spent the afternoon together, and then he spoke to the group. And he tells the story of how
William Garrett Piston.
Say
William Garrett Piston.
Thank you. You people are
I
good.
have the internet.
Oh, very good. So Piston came. He was a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, but he was telling the real story of how and why Longstreet was tarnished by the people who because he criticized Lee in an article, in a newspaper article after the war. He said his famous point was about Lee losing at Gettysburg, Lee losing his equipoise and deciding to attack, just do frontal assaults when it was his recklessness. He basically said that Lee was not his usual self.
Which Longstreet a little timid, accused of being a little timid at Gettysburg.
Well, it was, yeah, but the point was that Lee was using Longstreet's corps to do all the attacking. It was Longstreet's corps largely that did Pickett's charge on the third day, and it was Longstreet's corps that attacked that Little Round Top on the second day. And so, I think he saw the hopelessness of it, and because the battlefield was changing as he got his orders from Lee, and then the battlefield changed when the Union Third Corps came all the way out to Emmitsburg Road, and it just changed everything. It turned Lee's idea to do an echelon attack into a frontal assault, and that's why so many thousands of Confederates were killed there. But your other question was, I wanted to give it a more complete answer.
My other question was that there was a new, it wasn't a question, I thought there was a very new biography.
Oh, the new biography. There was one by Jeffrey Wirt. I met Jeffrey Wirt too. He came and he spoke one time at the Washington D.C. Roundtable. And that was fair. That was a good, good biography. There have been good biographies. One of the things I wanted to mention, and I'm proud of it, that's the time when we had the statue of Longstreet at Gettysburg was put up. There's no statue of Longstreet anywhere in the South because of his reputation, because of how badly he was tarnished. And they decided to try to raise money, private funds, to put a statue of Longstreet at Gettysburg. And I contributed to that because I felt that it was important that he was, I think he was Lee's number one lieutenant. And there's always a debate between Longstreet and Jackson. I think it was after the 7 days, Lee promoted both Lee and Jackson to lieutenant general on the same day. But I'm pretty sure I'm right on this. When the Army promotes people, you promote them. You could do it on the same day, but whoever you sign first is senior to that other person. And his old warhorse was senior technically, to Stonewall Jackson. I don't think that was by mistake. Because I think Jackson, Longstreet's performance, was what Lee needed more than anything. Jackson did a lot of his success on an independent command. And I think that's why he's given so much credit he deserves. But I think I think from Lee's standpoint, his war horse was the guy who did the most for him. And certainly after Jackson was killed in 1863, Longstreet was the guy. Yes.
Who were the people that were promoting getting a statue of Longstreet in that?
There was a group, the Sons of Confederate Veterans. One of the groups from North Carolina. I remember Mr. Thomas. I remember he came and he spoke. He was the key fundraising guy, and he came and spoke to the round table and made a serious pitch. And I mean, a lot of us bought into it, literally. They did a very good job. I think it was a fair thing. I'm glad, that he was honored there. He could use it, yes.
Speaking of independent action, did General Polk confer with anybody before he went into Kentucky, or did he
Yes.
decide that on his own?
Yes, he didn't absolutely do it on his own. I forgot, he had one other leader there who, I'm not sure which one it was. I'll find out and I'll tell you who it was next week. Yes.
I've got a book recommendation to finish you off.
Okay.
Chris Alberti says recommend Meade at Gettysburg by K.M. Brown, which offers a new research on very interesting points you are discussing on Lee and Longstreet.
Yep. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, there's so much that went into all that. The guy whose name I was trying to think of, and I'm still trying to think of, who was, he was the second in command. He was one of Ewell's division commanders. He became the lead spokesman and creator of the Lost Cause mythology. And essentially, he was the guy who did most of the writing against Longstreet in the papers, the Confederate papers that they published month to month in not in Richmond, but in Lynchburg. Oh, Lexington, Virginia, where Washington and Lee College is. Lee was the head of Washington College, and where Virginia military is. He and this group, or basically all were the three key guys who were former generals in Lee's army, and they all served at Gettysburg, and they all, I think, screwed up royally at Gettysburg. And I'm sure that book will probably support what I was saying. But and of course the Meade story is a fabulous story because he was just put in command of the Army of the Potomac a few days before the battle. But the difference was that Lee allowed Meade simply to fight a defensive battle. And Lee did all of the attacking and suffered so badly. And I think I know why. I think it's because Lee was desperate. Lee knew that he had to win a big battle. If he didn't win it then, he would lose the army. And I truly think, he never wrote that. I have his book, Lee's book, The Wartime Papers of Robert A. Lee. I'd recommend that for anybody who really wants to know in detail. Yes?
It reminded me a lot of George Washington. The same sentiment. If I don't win, people's terms of enlistments are up, they're gone, we're done. But the difference was Washington would always have a council of war with his generals or colonels or lieutenants, whoever, and they would have a stupid idea. He would appeal to that when he realized that nobody supported what he wanted to do.
And in the case, and I think it's fair to say that up until that time, with Lee having Jackson and Longstreet, I think he listened to them. But he didn't listen to Longstreet. He wasn't going to listen to Buell or A.P. Hill at Gettysburg because they were brand new. he had enough trouble keeping them working together. One of the reasons why they had the battle in such an unfortunate situation was A.P. Hill allowed his division commander to just ride into Gettysburg, and Lee told him specifically not to get engaged in a general battle until Longstreet's corps, which was following, arrived. And that was a crucial aspect of why it all eventuated the way it did. It was really unfortunate, but it was A.P. Hill who did that. On the other hand, in Ewell's corps, which had been the corps that got as far as Wrightsville, Pennsylvania, had to come running back to Gettysburg because that's where the armies were converging, because it was a major crossroad. It was Ewell's corps with his division commander that Lee told him that if at all practicable, take Cemetery Hill, if you can. It was these other guys who convinced Ewell that they shouldn't do it because of the if practicable. They didn't think it was practical. And so it was they prodded Ewell not to attack, and that really had everything to do with the way the battle eventuated as a loss. Questions on Kentucky? Not as much fun talking about Kentucky as it is, but the fact is that it wound up being a strong state, even though it was a slave state. They knew that their future was not with the Confederates. Period. Thank you. I'll see you next week. Thank you all.